All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. You know, we are currently standing right at the starting line of a massive structural global electricity supercycle. And sure, you hear a ton of buzzwords thrown around in the energy space these days, but what we're looking at today, it's a fundamental rewiring of exactly how the world powers itself. And more importantly, we're going to look at how specific companies are positioning themselves to capture this explosive growth.
To really grasp the stakes here, you just need to look at this one number, 7,400. That is a 7,400 terawatt-hour absolute increase in global power generation projected for the 2030s. To put that into perspective, that is a staggering acceleration compared to previous decades. The world is just getting thirstier for power, and the rate at which we need new electricity is completely breaking historical charts.
Let's start with Section 1, the global electricity supercycle.
So what's actually fueling this unprecedented surge? Well, it's not just one thing, right? It's a perfect storm of structural drivers. Between 2025 and 2030, we're not just looking at standard population growth, we're seeing massive fundamental technological shifts. For instance, data center power demand is projected to jump about 3 times by 2030. That adds up to 170 terawatt hours all on its own. Then you've got transport, with 50 million electric vehicles expected to hit the roads by 2025. You have huge industrial pushes for things like green hydrogen. And here's a totally fascinating detail. Just basic air conditioning and cooling is going to drive more than 20% of India's total electricity demand growth.
But here's where the geopolitical reality completely flips the script. For the last decade or so, renewables were largely driven by what you'd call a climate subsidy mindset, basically doing it for the environment. Well, that has fundamentally shifted. Energy security is aggressively replacing climate ambition as the main policy driver. Across the US, the EU, China, and India, scaling renewables is now a sovereignty mandate. It structurally reduces a nation's dependence on imported fossil fuels. So it's literally a matter of national security now.
Moving right along to Section 2, India's wind energy imperative.
Let's narrow the funnel from those huge global macro trends down to what's happening on the ground in India, because it's a country forecasted to have the absolute fastest growth pace in electricity demand over the next 15 years. And here is your anchor number for India, 1,164 gigawatts. That is the country's total untapped wind energy potential. It's just a mammoth resource pool waiting to be utilized.
And this massive opportunity? It's highly concentrated in just a few key states. Rajasthan holds the crown with 284 gigawatts of potential, followed pretty closely by Gujarat and Maharashtra. Now, when you realize that India currently only has about 56 gigawatts of installed wind capacity nationwide, you immediately see the incredible runway for growth here. We are barely scratching the surface of what's actually possible.
But, and this is a big but, there is a serious execution gap. Literally every credible scenario forecasts that India needs an absolute minimum of 100 gigawatts, with the general consensus sitting closer to 130 gigawatts of wind capacity by 2030. To hit that target, the industry needs to aggressively add 13 to 15 gigawatts every single year. The demand is totally unambiguous, but building the actual execution capacity to deliver on it, that's the primary challenge right now.
Which brings us to Section 3, solving the solar duck curve.
You know, with solar energy being so incredibly cheap these days, you might be wondering, why is wind even necessary for India's 2030 goals? Well, it all comes down to an engineering reality known as the duck curve. As grids add massive amounts of solar, they just get flooded with cheap power during the day. But obviously, solar sleeps when the sun sets. Just as everyone gets home from work and fires up their AC and appliances, solar generation drops off a cliff to zero. This creates a really severe, steep supply gap during those crucial evening and night peak hours. So I've got to pose this direct question to you. How on earth do we fill that massive evening power gap when the sun goes down? Because batteries alone, at their current scale and cost, are simply too expensive and limited to handle that entire load.
The answer, according to the data, is wind. Wind naturally complements solar, because wind generation very often picks up exactly in the evening and at night. Right now, in terms of filling that critical night peak gap, wind is playing a role roughly 5 times larger than battery storage. It's the structural necessity that literally keeps the grid stable when solar drops off.
And the market economics are actively pricing in this complementarity. Providing firm and dispatchable renewable energy, or FDRE, using just solar and battery storage is pricey. But a wind-solar hybrid setup, that provides a massive 2.9 rupee per kilowatt-hour discount compared to standalone solar trying to cover those peak times.
Wind just inherently lowers the overall system cost.
To ensure all this critical infrastructure actually gets built, India rolled out the ALMM framework. This is a policy that restricts government projects to an approved list of models and manufacturers. It directly mirrors the trade policies we're seeing in the US and the EU. It actively incentivizes domestic clean energy manufacturing. Ultimately, it's designed to reward original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, who have deep, localized, domestic supply chains. That gives them a durable, long-term competitive advantage over imported equipment.
All right, Section 4, Suzlon's financial foundation.
Okay, so we've looked at the massive global demand, India's urgent targets, and the structural engineering need for wind. Now let's shift our lens to a formal financial analysis of a corporate protagonist right at the epicenter of all this. We're looking at Suzlon Energy, drawing directly from the recent ICRA credit rating report to see if they actually have the bedrock required to scale up to this massive challenge.
First, let's get a reality check on Suzlon's market position. Founded way back in 1995, they hold a commanding 29% cumulative market share in India. By the end of 2025, they had over 15.5 gigawatts of installed capacity domestically. And crucially, they aren't just assembling parts, they are a vertically integrated wind turbine generator manufacturer. They design the components, execute the massive infrastructure projects, and they run the ongoing operations and maintenance. They do the whole shebang.
Now, the financial validation here is absolutely critical. ICRA recently affirmed Suzlon's rating at A+, with a stable outlook across 2,635 crore rupees in rated limits. Why does that matter? Well, in the heavy infrastructure game, a strong credit rating is literally the lifeblood of your ability to execute on mega projects. This A+ rating firmly signals that they have the financial readiness to absorb that surging demand we discussed earlier.
And remember that ALMM framework we just talked about? The policy that specifically rewards localized domestic supply chains? Well, this A+ rating applies to Suzlon's fully consolidated operations. That includes their forging subsidiary SE Forge, their global services arm, Renome Energy Services, and a whole host of other subsidiaries. They own the deeply integrated domestic supply chain that government policy is explicitly trying to incentivize and reward.
So, when we step back and look at the physical infrastructure driving this whole macro supercycle, the narrative becomes crystal clear. We have a 7,400 terawatt-hour surge in global demand. We have an undeniable engineering need to pair wind with solar to stabilize the grid. And we have domestic policies explicitly favoring deeply integrated local manufacturers. Which leaves us with this final, major thought to chew on. We know India has a staggering 1,164 gigawatts of untapped wind potential. We know Suzlon has locked in an A+ stable financial foundation and a vertically integrated domestic supply chain. Looking at the massive execution gap required over the next 5 years, who else is actually positioned to capture this specific slice of the global electricity supercycle? It is an absolutely fascinating space to watch, and the blueprint for the 2030s, it's already being built today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you next time.